Okay, welcome back. Now I am getting a bit bored of retopologizing letters, so I thought I'd take a kind of a break just for one video to try to bring some of the ideas behind subdivision surface modeling together for you. It is going to be fairly advanced, but I just really want to show you why subdivision surface modeling is a powerful technique. Okay, now the M can be tricky, similar to the lowercase e in many ways, in that we need to find an escape route for the internal geometry. So, well, let's select the text object, and I'll press del to focus on it, and oh, look, the shrink wrapping on the P has failed at one vertex. Now I'm glad it's done that, so I can show you how to handle that when we get there. It's really simple. Anyway, back to the M. Tab into edit mode, press 1 for point select mode, and I'll select all the vertices which make up the M by odd clicking on any one of them. And don't worry that your vertex colours are probably not the same as mine. I change them all the time, and it makes it easier for you to see them in the video. No other difference at all. Hot pink today with blue edges. Good. And I'm just going to zoom into this letter by pressing del on the keypad and pressing 1 for the front view. Okay, I'm going to separate this into a new object by pressing P and choosing selection. Then I'll tab into object mode, select the new object, press F2 and rename it M. Now the problem with the M is this middle leg here. There will be two loops creating the internal geometry here later on, and they'll kind of enter the mesh here and they need somewhere to exit the mesh. And we normally use the extremities to do this, or a completely straight section of the shape where they won't cause any trouble. On the M, we don't have these options. These escape routes are used for other areas of internal geometry. In fact, the only really good option we do have is to exit at this point here in the dip of the M. There are lots of other reasons to use this point as well, but I won't go into them here as that's a much deeper conversation. Anyway, that gives us an exit point for one of our internal loops, but that means the other one will have to go through a curved section, which means a slightly different method at one point where we have to add some of the internal geometry as we work on the initial shape. Let's just get on and make it. Hopefully it'll make more sense when we get going. So the first thing to do is change to edge select mode and fill in this big face at the bottom of the middle leg. And I also want to fill in two more faces so that I can connect this point here to this one just to the right of the point which marks the dip at the top of the M. And I have filled this far up the middle leg just to avoid long stretched polygons. Now, I just want to straighten up this edge here, actually, just by selecting each of its vertices and aligning them with this point here. So, G, Z, Control, Hover, Click. And I'm actually going to add a vertice to each side of the right-hand leg as well, and align those to exactly the same level. Good. Now that I've done this, I can work on this side as usual. So, select the points around the top here, and there are 9. I'll just space those out. Now along the bottom of this curve I'll select all of those, and there are only 8. So I need to add one more in here, and then I can space these out. I can now switch back to edge selection mode, select this top edge running across the letter, and press F to fill all those in down to the bottom. Now I want to go back to this edge, and I want to move along 3 vertices. I need to leave these 2 here to connect to the internal geometry later. So this third vertice along needs to attach to the other side of this filled face down here. I'll go to edge selection mode again, select this new edge and fill in around to the next corner. And if I'm happy with that, which I am, then we're all good. We don't need to add any more vertices here to make this work. So let's go back to point mode and look at this edge here, and I can see I've got 4 unconnected vertices here, so I need 4 at the other side. I'm going to press Ctrl R and just left click, and then Ctrl R again and type 3 and hit enter. So we have 4 new vertices in total. I like to line these up as usual, so G, Z, Control, Hover and Click, and I want to do that for all 4 of them. I should just say that if holding Control doesn't work for you at this point, then you might need to check that this little snapping icon at the top is set to Vertex snapping. Okay, now go to 2 for edge mode, and I'm going to fill these in from the bottom to the top. Now I want to put some extra loops in along all of the legs, so I'm going to add 5 loops in here, 5 in here, and 5 in here. Great. I've got this little ascender on the top here, so I'm just going to add 1 loop in there. Okay, now at this point we just need a quick fix for this gap here. And can I just say at this point, all of this filling in of faces and edges is really just to help you see the process so you don't get lost and you have a clear visual clue as to what's been done and what's not. I've been doing this a long time and I don't really need to fill in the faces anymore. In fact, it's a few extra steps when you're retopologizing a typeface of nearly 100 separate characters, and every step adds time I just don't want to use. Every second counts. But filling in the faces is very useful when you're kind of starting out learning this process. And the easiest way to do it at this stage is just to fill them in with one big n-gon face. Obviously it'll be all quads by the time we're finished. So I just select all the points around the edge and press F to fill them in with this n-gon. Okay, so that stage is done. Let's tab to object mode and apply the shrink wrap modifier with Ctrl A. I'm going to tab back to edit mode, and in edge select mode, I'm going to press A to select everything. Now press W to just select the border. Press Ctrl and I to invert the selection so that just the internal edges are selected. And then press X and choose edges to clear out all of the middle completely. I'm going to switch to point select mode, press A to select everything, F to fill, I to inset, type 0.001 and hit enter. Now press X and choose faces to get rid of those big n-gons. I'm going to alt and click near the inside edge anywhere inside the letter. Press GG, hold Alt, type -30 and hit enter. Then you let go of the Alt key and we have our correct border. Now I can fill in from the bottom of the right hand leg up until the vertex just before the point, or the dip in the middle of the M. Now I can fill in from the bottom of the middle leg until those faces kind of touch. Now I want to connect this vertice at the edge of the filled face to the third vertice along, again, just as we did before. And I'm going to press 2 for edge mode and fill these faces in along to the next corner. Now I'll select the bottom edge here and just fill in up to the top. Now to fill this hole, I first need to add the internal geometry for the middle leg. So Ctrl and R and roll the mouse until there are the 2 loops that we always have, left click and right click. Now, because of these 2 new vertices that have been added here, because we did that, I can simply select one of the edges at either side and fill in the middle section. That's great. Now I can add all the other control loops, so along the edge and across the top, and that looks great. Press Ctrl and A to select everything, press Shift and N to recalculate the normals. I'm just going to tab into object mode, I'll press Ctrl and 3 for the subdivision surface modifier, and right click to shade smooth. I'm going to tab back to edit mode and quickly look at it with the on cage switch turned on, and that looks perfect. Everything flows really nicely. Okay, so let's turn that off and we can add some tightening loops. So we need one at the top here. You know, I'm going to say the key presses for this one more time, but then I'm going to stop doing that because it's driving me mad. So Ctrl and R and hover between these first 2 edges and the letter at this extremity. I'm going to left click, press E so they're an even distance from one of the edges, and if the red dot is not at the outside edge, press F to flip it and just do that until it is. I'm going to move it into place so that the corners are sharpened up. Left click, right click and choose Mark Scene. Okay, I really don't want to say that again. Now we need 3 loops at the bottom, and because they're all on the same level I can move all 3 at once. So I can add one here, left click and right click, one here and one here. Now I select all 3, press GG, E, maybe F, and move them down. That's great, mark them as a seam. So let me just say that when marking these edges as a seam, it does nothing at all. It's just a visual reference. Whenever I see a red loop on a mesh, I know I can just Alt and click to select it all and press GG to slide it around safely to change the curvature at one side of it. I also use Mark Sharp in the menu, but I only use that for partial loops, and I've not gone into using those yet. I will do that another day. Okay, now on the original letter, this dip in the middle of the M is quite sharp. If I just turn on the targets object, we can see that it's quite sharp, and ours is very loose. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to use this point as one of our exit points for the internal geometry, so we can safely add either 1 or 2 loops to either side of it to sharpen this point without affecting anything else in our geometry. If I select this loop running down and press Ctrl and B to bevel it, I'll just roll the mouse so that there are 3 loops in total, I can sharpen this point perfectly. I'll just put it there. And then I'll mark both of these new loops in red, and they can be moved any time with GG just to sharpen or loosen this point. And I might want to sharpen this one as well, just by adding a loop in here. I'm going to move it down. And I'm going to use G stretch with project on this loop just to space out the geometry. And again, if you look at this corner, you can see that this is the only thing that changes when I use GG to slide this loop. And that's what we're aiming for. Control loops which don't mess with your shape in any other way, but when they're moved, they control something useful. That's very much the essence of subdivision surface modeling. Okay, that's all great. I'll just move the camera a little. Now I'll press A to select everything, E, Y and 0.4 to extrude it. I'll press 3 to go to face select mode, Alt and click on one of the edges around the cross section. I'll press I and type 0.04 and hit enter. I'll press W just to choose the border and choose Mark Seam. And now I'm going to tab back to object mode and put the origin in the correct place. So right click, set origin, origin to geometry. I'm going to press Shift and S and choose cursor to selected. I'm going to reset the cursor's Z location to 0. I'm going to right click again, choose set origin, origin to 3D cursor. Now I'm going to press Ctrl and A and then press R to reset the rotation. I'm going to add our material as usual. And I'm going to move this letter into our collection by selecting it in the outliner and pressing M and choosing Arial Black Friendly. Okay, so rather than do any more letters in this one, I want to make something interesting but fairly simple to demonstrate why we use techniques like this to make text and logos. I mean, it is going to seem complicated to you at first, but really it is simple. Some of the things I will do here definitely fall into the advanced category, but it all follows a very simple logic that you'll get used to with time and practice. And there will be some interesting bits in there as well. I'm going to show you some things you probably haven't seen before. So I'm going to select our M and press Shift and Edge to hide everything else. I'm going to change the colour of our material to, well, let's make it orange, as I often do in these videos. Then in Edit mode, I'm going to select the boundary loop which lies on the very edge of the front of the letter. Then I'm going to go to Select, Select Loops, and Select Loop Inner Region, which just selects all the faces on the front. Now I'm going to press Ctrl and minus to shrink this selection, and I'm going to press I just to inset this a little way. Now I'm going to press Ctrl and plus again to expand my selection back out, and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to add a new material to our object. I'll just leave it as white, maybe reduce the roughness a little. And if I now press Assign just here, then these faces will be turned white. Now I'm just going to zoom in right to the edge here, and in Edge mode I'm going to press Ctrl and R to add a loop just between the edges of the first white face. Now in Face Select mode again, I'm just going to Alt and click on any edge on the outside border to select the whole thing. I'm going to press Ctrl and plus to expand this selection, and in the material properties I'm going to select the orange material, press Assign, and in the 3D view press Ctrl and minus so that we just have the outside border selected again. Now I'm going to press E to extrude and press Y to make it along the Y axis, and I'm just going to move this out here to create this nice border. Now I might want this border to be a little more square, so I can add a loop around the top here. And I'm going to mark it as a seam to tell myself that it controls an aspect of curvature. And another one here inside the shape in the border, and mark that as a seam too. And I can move or delete these seams anytime to adapt my shape. I might want to make the back of the letter much more rounded by sliding its control loop back and forwards. Remember that all of our control loops will still do their jobs perfectly. I could easily change the roundness at the bottom of these legs, for example, just by Alt and clicking on any red loop and pressing GG to slide it. I don't want to do that though, this looks pretty good. I might want to make this letter much thicker, and to do that, we never scale an object along just one axis. You only ever really scale things to change their overall size. So I want to go into Edit mode. I'll just use X-ray mode so I can select all the vertices no matter where they are. I'm going to press 3 to go into the side view. I'm going to select all the vertices at the back and then just kind of move them along in Y, just to make this letter a little thicker. And doing it this way preserves our curvature. And there are many more things we could do with our text, but for now that looks good. I'll just turn off X-ray mode and tab into object mode. So let's work with this M. Now, as you've seen me do lots of times, I can just add a simple deform modifier to this and bend and twist it to make sure it doesn't break, and it won't. I'll just leave it as a bend in X around 50 degrees and turn this modifier off for now. I'm just going to turn down the resolution of the sub D modifier while I work. Level 1 will be enough. I might turn it off altogether later if we need good response times if I go really mad with the modifiers. And the first thing I really want to do is get a few more letters in a row here. So I'm going to add an array modifier and just move it to the top of the stack. I'll just make the count 5 and we can imagine it's a more interesting word than just And straight away you might see a problem. The letters are all kind of butted up against one another, and the temptation for you will be to change the offset to space them out. Well, don't. That is not flexible enough a way to space them out. And whether you use relative or constant, it doesn't matter. It will cause problems with lots of other effects. The way we do this kind of spacing is to add what we call ghost geometry to our letter. You probably won't have seen this before, but it's a really common and really precise way to handle the spacing of arrays in Blender. I'm going to tab into Edit mode and select any vertice at all, it doesn't matter. I'm going to press Shift and D to duplicate it, and I'm going to move it along the X-axis. And you'll see, as I do, that this interactively changes the spacing of the lettering. I'm not going to use it for long, but I will show you that we would normally make a new vertex group out of this single vertex, and I'd call it something like letter spacing X. You can call it anything. I just put the X on the end there to remind me on which axis it moves. And with that vertex group, I can select that at any time to change the spacing of things in my array. I'll demonstrate why it's a better way to do it in a moment. So I'm just going to put it here. Now that's great because it's interactive, but that's not the most useful thing about it. In fact, I'm going to apply this array modifier, and I need to get rid of those ghost vertices, and I do that by going to Edit mode, Point Select mode, then choosing Select, Select by Trait, and Loose Geometry. Now I can just press X and choose vertices to get rid of them. You do have to be very careful about leaving non-manifold geometry in your meshes. And so we have now what could just be a logo or some text we want to use. So let's do something with it. I can add another array modifier, move it to the top of the stack, and I can make it so that we have 3 copies of our text. And now I'll show you a problem with using the offsets in the array modifier properties. If I change this to 1.2, then it all looks good. But what about when I apply other modifiers after this one? I can turn our simple deform modifier on here, and you can see that the text all bends very nicely because it has excellent topology. But if I add, say, another simple deform modifier, and I change the bending to the z-axis, again it all works well until I want to make it a full circle. If I change the bending angle to 360 degrees, you'll see that the very first and the very last occurrences of our are butted up together, and that's not good enough. We need the same gap between each version of our text or logo. So again, we use ghost geometry to achieve this. I'll reset the factor x in here to be 1. We always have it set to 1. And as before, I'll tab into edit mode, select a point, any point, I'm going to duplicate it, and I am immediately going to make a vertex group for it with Ctrl and G. And I'll call this group word space X. And I'll press G and X to move this point along, and as I do, you can see that all of the spacing is even and correct. All of the words are spaced out correctly. And I have this vertex group here to be able to change that interactively at any time. Okay, that's great. We now have our text bending in 2 directions. And we could easily animate that to do lots of things. In fact, let's quickly animate the bending of the letters around the x-axis in this simple deform modifier. I'll go to the first frame of the animation. I'm going to set the angle to, let's just say, 60. And I'll right-click the angle and choose Insert Keyframe. You can see the keyframe in the timeline as this little orange diamond. Now I'll go to frame 15 and set the angle to -60 and set a keyframe. Finally, I'm going to go to frame 30 and change it to 60 again and insert a keyframe here. Okay, that's great, we can see that animating, but I want that to continue kind of forever, which I can quickly do by changing the timeline window down here to a graph editor, and in the channel menu I can select extrapolation mode and choose make cyclic F modifier. You may know what that all means, but this isn't really an animation tutorial, so I don't want to start explaining all that. It just means that the animation on this object will just keep looping over and over again. I just changed this window back to a timeline and we can look at that. And I'm just going to move this subdivision surface modifier to the end of the stack. Eventually we'd have 2 subdivision surface modifiers, but don't worry about that for now. And everything will play back in real time. And don't forget, all of our control loops still do exactly the same thing. Even when it's deformed, we can still change all of our curvature whenever we want, and nothing will break. So that's all very interesting, but let's do something else new. I'm just going to temporarily disable these 3 modifiers here and leave the sub-D modifier active. Now I'm going to set the origin of our object to its geometry, but in the dialog box down here, I'm going to change it to bound center. And I'm doing that because I want to add a lattice object. And that's what we do when we add a lattice object. Now, I'm going to move the 3D cursor to the object by pressing Shift and S, cursor to selected, and I'm going to press Shift and A and select lattice from this menu. Now, I'm going to quickly move the origin of our text back to the bottom just by setting the 3D cursor's Z location to 0, and then right-clicking on our text object and choosing Set Origin, Origin to 3D Cursor. Good. Now, back to our lattice object. I want to copy the Y and Z scale from our object to the dimensions of the lattice. So I select the object in the end panel and I'll look for the dimensions over here and hover over the Y dimension and press Ctrl and C to copy it. Now I'll select the lattice object and paste that into its Y dimension just by pressing Ctrl and V. And I'll do exactly the same process for the Z dimension. Select the object, hover over Z, press Ctrl and C, select the lattice, hover over Z and press Ctrl and V. Good, now our lattice is the same size as our text object. Great. I'm just going to scale it along X by any amount really, that'll do. Now with the lattice selected, I'm going to go to the lattice properties and I'm going to change the resolution here to 555. And I'm going to go to the front view by pressing 1 on the number pad. And now I'm going to select the text object and add a new modifier. I want to add a lattice modifier. For now I'm just going to move it to the top of the stack, and in the drop down box for object I want to select our lattice object, and that kind of pairs the 2 things together. Whatever I do to the lattice will directly affect our text. I might just hide the text object while I do this next part. So I'm going to select the lattice and tab into object mode and make sure I'm in the front view. What I want to do is select the 3 inner rows of vertices. I'm going to press S to scale, press Shift and X so that it only scales along the Y and Z axes, and type 1.8 and hit enter. Now I want to select the first row from the edge and type RX90 to rotate it 90 degrees around the X-axis. I'll just select the second row and type RX180. And then the next row along, I'm going to type RX and 270. Now I don't think you actually have to do that last row, but for the life of me, I really don't understand how that works. Anyway, if I now turn on the visibility of our text, you can see what's happened. The text is now twisted with the lattice. It can be hard to see what's happening, so I always like to go to the object properties of the lattice, go to viewport display, and change display as to bounds, which just kind of turns it into this wireframe cube. That makes it much easier to see what's going on. I also like to set the little padlocks for everything in the lattice, except for the location X and the scale X, just so I don't accidentally move it somewhere I'm not supposed to for this effect. I might just scale the lattice now until I get a kind of a twist that I like. And I can move it. It'll only move along the X-axis now because of the little padlocks. And you can see everything twisting inside it. It looks really good. And you can see it's really responsive. No discernible lag as we move it. And what if I now go back to the text and turn on the array modifier? So we have our 3 copies. Now, when I move the lattice, all 3 of them twist at the same time. Or, if I want to move this lattice along all of them, I could just move the lattice modifier down below the array. Now when I move it, it travels along the whole line of text, and our text is robust, so I can turn on the next modifier, which bends the text around the X-axis. And now all of these deformations are happening together, and everything is still perfectly smooth. What about the next modifier? Another simple deform, which wraps it into a circle. It looks great like that, but I can still move my lattice object from side to side, and now the twist goes around the circle. Oh, and of course, the text is animating, so if I press play, I see that I can still move the lattice along X and Y with everything animating and it all works properly. Now, I worry things are getting a little too complicated just for this example, but we could add more arrays and more deformers. If you look at the opening sequence for my last video, you'll see the text wrapping into a torus. And you can wrap all of your twisting, animating text onto a sphere, or any shape really. And then you deform that shape, and the possibilities go on, and everything will work perfectly because we've retopologized our text correctly. Now there are even more steps to make everything smooth and perfect, but I have to stop somewhere, and this seems like a good place. And I'm not suggesting you'll be able to do any of this at first, but everything you do learn about modeling and deforming and animating things along the way won't be problematic for you when your underlying base meshes are good. And that is subdivision surface modeling, and that's why we do it. Okay, great. I think that is enough for this one. For the next video, I will get back to the slightly dull process of retopologizing the letters, but hopefully now you can see a little bit better why it is worth the effort. Now, I do have a lot on in the real world at work at the moment, so I won't be able to make a new video for a couple of weeks. But when I do come back, I promise I'll have a whole new bunch of techniques that you probably haven't seen before. Okay, thanks very much. See you next time. Cheers.